Hello and welcome back to the IEA YouTube channel. I'm Emily Carver, Head of Media at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So, calm seems to have been restored in Canada, at least for now. After 3 weeks of occupying the capital, Canadian police have succeeded in clearing the truckers out of Ottawa. But is this the end or just the beginning of a larger social movement? The so-called Freedom Convoys began as a protest against COVID vaccine mandates for cross-border truckers. This then turned into a broader protest, a protest against Trudeau's leadership and the continuing COVID restrictions in the country. For days, weeks, the internet was awash with extraordinary images of the convoys. I believe one reached 45 miles, made up of over 50,000 truckers. To end the protest, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, invoked the Emergencies Act, the first time since the law was passed in 1988. The Act gave him the power to ban public assembly, prohibit travel to protest zones, and even freeze bank accounts. While calm may have returned to the capital, there is no sign that Trudeau will relinquish his emergency powers just yet. Truckers remain outside the capital, and he fears they could plan further blockades. On Monday night, the House of Commons voted 185 to 151 to affirm the powers, giving the police the right to suppress any potential restart of blockades. This has obviously inflamed tensions, with many arguing that Trudeau's actions are not proportionate to the level of threat posed by the protest and demonstrate his lust for state intervention over personal liberty. Others, however, believe the Canadian government to be right in clamping down on the truckers, insisting vaccine mandates are important to prevent the spread of COVID, and that this type of disruption to ordinary people's lives cannot be tolerated. Joining me to discuss the extraordinary events is Fred McMahon. Fred is resident fellow at the classical liberal think tank, the Fraser Institute, and holder of the Dr. Michael A. Walker Chair in Economic Freedom. We also have Fraser Myers, who is deputy editor of Spiked and a political commentator who has criticised openly the Canadian government's response to the protests. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, Fred, there's been lots of conflicting reports from Canada. Firstly, do you agree with my opening summary on the facts there? And as a Canadian, speaking from Canada, I don't believe you've witnessed the protests yourself, but could you give me your perspective on what's been going on?
Sure, and you got it exactly right. By the way, I've missed this protest, but Canada has had a number of violent hockey protests when the teams lost, and I've witnessed those and smelled tear gas. So, witnessed from the sides. The protests had to be pulled down. They were simply attacking the freedom of too many Canadians. The border protest, for example, was a blow for economic freedom. Voluntary exchanges of goods were prevented by truckers stopping the goods flowing across the border. Voluntary travel and movement was also stopped. In Ottawa, property rights were immensely violated. I mean, how can you enjoy your apartment or condo or house if trucks are honking 24 hours a day? And even when they weren't, how would you like to have a semi on 24 hours a day parked outside your place? People couldn't go to work. Huge violations of the economic freedom and other freedoms of Canadians. So yes, the protests had to be handled. One of the bizarre things is people are always talking about freedom that the truckers were demanding and talking about disruption, but ignoring the huge negative impact on the freedom of Canadians and people living in Ottawa. Now, was the Emergency Act necessary? The Trudeau government has been incompetent on a huge number of files, and certainly their handling of the winding down of COVID restrictions has been a disaster, and their approach to the truckers has been a disaster. So this was a crisis that should have lasted a few days and been contained with normal government powers. By the time it had moved into this huge violation of the freedom of others, actions had to be taken. I doubt the emergency measures was necessary, but there was such a large level of incompetence in Canada, there may have been no other way to handle it. It could have been handled well, even at that point in time under existing powers, but the incompetence was so large and the need so great to protect the freedom of Canadians in general. Maybe it was a necessary move, again, just because of incompetence.
I mean, that's very interesting. From over in the UK, we've obviously our freedoms. I don't know how aware you are of where we are in the pandemic, but essentially we're moving back to an entirely free society. We have no vaccine mandates. We don't have vaccine passports. Do you not believe that the protests were justified?
The protests, well, freedom of speech, demonstrations are always justified, whether you agree with the point of view or not. So yes, protests were justified, but that doesn't give you a right to attack other people's freedom. If you go back to John Locke, as he said, freedom is not a liberty for every man to do what he lists, for who could be free when every other man's humor might domineer over him. And we forget that classical foundation of liberal freedom, which is freedom under the rule of law that protects the freedom of all. So yes, of course the protests were justified, but when they turned into an attack on the freedom of people in Ottawa, on the freedom of Canadians generally, then the rule of law, as John Locke could say, must be asserted.
Fraser, I mean, you've spoken out about what you saw as an authoritarian response from both Trudeau and the police and the authorities in Canada. Do you take Fred's point that if a protest is infringing on, I guess, the rights and freedoms of others, then therefore it may be justified to clamp down in a harsh way?
Well, I think, yeah, it's important to say that the right to protest is not absolute. It's not the same as freedom of speech. It is an imposition on public space. That's absolutely correct. But there are different ways to handle this. And you could see on the Ambassador Bridge, for example, which we talked about earlier, that was starting to be resolved through normal police processes. And that's the right thing to do. When people are blocking a highway or something like that, then the police have every right to remove them. I would say similar things about, when we have Extinction Rebellion protests in the UK or Insulate Britain protests, people sitting in front of a road. The police should be moving those people on. They have every right to make their point. They have every right to try and demonstrate where they want, but when they need to be moved on, they need to be moved on. What I object to is the use of emergency powers, almost wartime powers, to deal with what is essentially a disruptive protest. And yes, it is very disruptive. There's no question about that. But some of the measures taken were not just giving the police more powers to fine and arrest people, but also to freeze people's bank accounts, to freeze accounts, of anyone related to the protests. And we have to remember that also came on top of a crackdown from big tech, independent of government. Firms like GoFundMe were taking matters into their own hands and deciding they wanted to, seize the funds of protesters or return. Eventually, they returned the funds after a backlash. So I think we have to, make a distinction between what are the ordinary, appropriate police powers for dealing with disruption, and powers that really should be held in reserve for the most serious of emergencies that threaten the state. And, it was telling that the last time equivalent powers were used in Canada, it was to deal with a very serious terrorist emergency, the October crisis in 1970. And even then, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association at the time said, this is possibly going a bit too far. Many of us have criticised the use of emergency lawmaking after 9/11 to deal with terror attacks. It's not. We can even still recognise that authoritarianism or authoritarian laws can be reflexively and sometimes unthinkingly used in situations of real danger. Mm-hmm. So we have to be extra careful when what we're talking about is really just a disruptive protest.
Yeah, Fred. obviously on Monday night, the Commons voted in favour of affirming the powers. I don't know if there's a timeline on that. Is there a date in which there needs to be another vote or another debate? And one of the concerns in this country with the government's emergency powers to deal with the pandemic was that, once a government takes powers, they find it very difficult to give them back. Would you agree with that point? Do you have any concerns that these emergency powers may be used and reused at times when Trudeau feels under threat?
Okay, well, first off, I think we should be careful about language. Calling this a disruption, and I know that Fraser is aware of what happened, but viewers, when they hear this called a disruption, may get an entirely false idea of what was going on. Billions and billions and billions of dollars of Canadian trade, free trade, what should be free trade, were being held up at the border for 2 or 3 weeks. Life of the citizens in Ottawa had their freedoms violated, heavily violated, for 3 whole weeks. This was just not an average disruption. I, of course, agree with Fraser that it could have been properly handled by authorities early on, and that Trudeau himself bears some blame for the incompetence. But it's not a simple, small disruption. It's not a couple people standing in the way of a car or whatever. This was an emergency, a real emergency. Whether we needed...
Just on that, I think it's fair to say that we haven't in this country experienced anything like that on that scale. I mean, I can't remember anything like that. Even in the run up to the Iraq War, we had a million people walking by foot for a short amount of time. I can't remember when we've had similar protests. Sorry, just wanted to note that.
Yeah. So the war, and there's a huge distinction between the War Measures Act done by Trudeau's father and the Emergency Measures Act. Provinces can opt out. No military has been involved this time that would allow that. And the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this Emergency Act is predominant over the Emergency Act itself. So those aren't suspended. However, I agree with Fraser about whether it was necessary, and I am particularly troubled by the freezing of bank accounts. The GoFundMe froze. They're a private organization. They can make the choices themselves. So I don't, get disturbed by that, but I am disturbed, like Fraser, with some of the overreach here, particularly on the bank accounts. It's been approved by Parliament. It's in effect, I think, only in Ontario, because Alberta and other provinces have either rejected it or been unwilling to impose it, which is their right. It does have a sunset clause, but I'm honestly not sure when that is, but it can't last too long. Public opposition would be just immense. So actually, Fraser and I agree on most things, a little bit of around the edges, but on most things.
Now, one thing that I found quite interesting is something that, Fraser, you've commented on, is how the protesters were portrayed by the Trudeau government and also parts of the media as being far-right agitators, sweeping statements about anti-vaxxers. I think also some were called, racists or compared to, fascists or whatever. To what extent was that the case? And do you think this is a way that governments around the whole world try to, diminish or talk down certain elements who don't agree with the political line?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are always going to be some problematic people at protesters, and the clear problem at these protests, well, twofold. One was the presence of some people flying swastika flags and US Confederate flags, but I think that became a kind of pretext to tarnish everyone as a racist, essentially. And the other factor is, of course, with it inevitably being with a protest about vaccine mandates, it inevitably attracts anti-vaxxers. That's not something you can do anything about, even if, you know, it's possible, and I'm sure many people there will have been vaccinated. Apparently, I've read that 90% of Canadian truckers are fully vaccinated. Many people are able to draw that distinction between mandatory vaccination and being against vaccines per se, but of course, it attracts those kind of anti-science people. But what I was struck by was particularly the accusation that they were transphobic. And there was even a kind of leftist counter protest saying trans rights are human rights. And I mean, I could be completely wrong, but I've yet to see any link between this protest and trans issues. It's not something that people would have been talking about. It's not what people are protesting about. But I think it's become a kind of useful cudgel for, you know, kind of having a beating essentially what are blue collar working class people. There's almost a sense that before they've even opened their mouths, they must hold a kind of basket of sort of right wing views. They have, you know, and I've seen similar things in previous protests. This protest was very reminiscent of the Gilets jaunes in France, and I went to Paris to cover that several years ago. It was sparked by some environmental laws, a tax on the price of diesel, essentially, and then it became a broader movement around democracy, the cost of living, you know, the state of the economy, things like that. And very quickly, the people who were saying nothing about race issues or immigration were called far right and racist, and you know, so it's become part of I think a bit of a playbook for elites to demonize their opponents, and Trudeau is playing that perfectly. I mean, he just lists off these kinds of slurs really quite easily. It's very easy to him. I mean, I even heard him calling a Jewish MP who's sympathetic to the protest, calling her a Nazi sympathizer. But these things roll off the tongue with politicians like Trudeau. It's a way of just saying those people are beyond the pale, and it butters the public up for a crackdown, I guess, is the other sad factor.
It's true, isn't it, Fred? I mean, in this country, we've had protests against vaccine mandates, protests against lockdowns, and parts of the media and parts of the political establishment, whatever you want to call it, have sought to, essentially, in some ways, demonize those who went on the marches as being, completely anti-vax or as being, far right and so on. It's something that people in our media and our political establishment do, isn't it, to discredit these movements?
I couldn't agree more with both of you. Some of the rhetoric, particularly Trudeau's rhetoric. I mean, I could say something insulting about the protesters or even Trudeau here, but I'm not prime minister. It doesn't spur things on. His rhetoric has been absolutely horrible, dismissing these people in the most insulting way, even going beyond the media, which would have a liberal bias. So I couldn't agree more. But I'm troubled by the bad rhetoric on both sides. Trudeau is an incompetent, left-leaning prime minister, center-left, but sort of on the left of center-left, introducing some really bad policies. But he's not the son of Fidel Castro, as one American commentator actually claimed. Difficult to tell whether he was joking or not, but he actually said that. So I'm disappointed and alarmed by the over rhetoric on both sides of the fence.
That's true. There's always an element of hypocrisy sometimes when the right, criticizes the left for saying, slanderous things or slurring them. And it does happen both ways more often than not. Also, there's a lot of people on the right who were very quick to ask for tougher action when it came to Black Lives Matter protests or Extinction Rebellion protests. And then they were up in arms over the reaction to what's happened in Canada. So you can't have it both ways always, even if you decide that one cause is more noble than the other. In terms of broadening this out a bit, in terms of Trudeau and his leadership, do you believe that he still has the support of the Canadian people? Of course, he's been quite divisive, but in this country, he was definitely held up as a kind of, a liberal pin-up, the same, similar to how we saw Jacinda Ardern as someone who was, thoughtful and a liberal, a good person, someone who we need in the West to lead us. And it seems that now his reputation has gone in the other direction, and people are looking to him as some kind of tyrant in some quarters. How are the Canadian people reacting to this, Fred?
Well, first, just let me note something colorful, if I may. I was in Bhutan when he was elected at a meeting supporting economic freedom, and all the young women there were just energetic and enthusiastic that this handsome young man had been elected Prime Minister of Canada. And they repeatedly compared him to the previous King of Bhutan, who was a sex symbol himself, particularly in Thailand. So the repercussions were amazing, this outburst of enthusiasm in Bhutan and even Thailand. Fraser probably has experienced it, or you've experienced it elsewhere. The Trudeau government has enacted many policies that will hurt the Canadian economy and hurt the Canadian people. I mean, we aren't talking about Titanic. I have trouble pronouncing even the simplest words. We aren't talking about a doomsday economic disaster, but bad stuff. On the other side, the incompetence is stunning. Not just with this, but with just about everything else. I mean, normally when it's a scandal, it's because you do something in an illegal or unethical way to get a result that you couldn't get through legal and ethical means. Trudeau's great scandals could have achieved the same result in legal and ethical ways. They were just too incompetent to deal with it. The reason Trudeau is still in power, now the opposition party here is called the Conservatives. You have them in England. And when Trudeau calls an election, the two leaders of the Conservative Party he's faced, you would think they were campaigning as strongly as they could to re-elect Trudeau, because their incompetence on the campaign trail has been as stunning as Trudeau's. No, his reputation is severely damaged. He should have lost the last two elections. Canadians, international people, only notice Canada during times of scandal. I remember walking into a hotel room in Jakarta, turning on the television and seeing Rob Ford, the drunken, drug-addicted mayor of Toronto, as the top story. So I guess with this, we become a top story again. By the way, just as a note of interest, Rob Ford's brother, Doug Ford, is Premier of Canada's largest province, and if he spoke French, would very likely become Prime Minister.
Interesting. We'll watch out for that. Fraser, do you think we can draw comparisons between the leadership of Trudeau and other Western leaders, like Jacinda Ardern, like Macron to an extent, that there is an element of virtue signalling over substance, and then that perhaps as they reveal their true colours and incompetence, in the words of Fred, Western electorates are going to decide they've had enough of that kind of politics, that woke politics over substance?
Well, the question is always, is there enough of a unified opposition to it? And I think that's clearly the problem in Canada. I think that's potentially a problem in France. I mean, Macron is slightly different because he's tacked very much to the right, and his opponents are really, really very right-wing. So that there's kind of not much sensible for people to opt for. Trudeau's been a bit of a gift for someone like me, who's been warning for ages and ages that wokeness is not just substance free, that it is actually a species of authoritarianism. It presents itself as socially liberal, as inclusive, but actually it's incredibly divisive. It considers significant numbers of people who simply don't quite share the right opinions as beyond the pale, as people who can't be included in our vision of the nation. It divides people by race, it divides people by gender, and it has no regard for liberty, as I think this latest Emergency Act debacle has shown. Certainly has no regard for freedom of speech in any case. So I think it's much more dangerous. I wish he was just virtue signalling, but I think there's something a bit more scary beneath the surface.
Yes, I agree. I mean, look to Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, who's very much woke on the outside, but on the inside, very authoritarian in many ways. In a previous video, someone said that female leaders sometimes seem to get away with it a little more, like Jacinda Ardern, who then turned out to be very authoritarian as well. But I don't want to, slander my gender, my sex. Just to finish, Fred, as with the Institute of Economic Affairs, and you're an expert on economic freedom, I don't know too much about the Canadian economy in general. Of course, these protests were blocking off trade routes and so on. How is the Canadian economy looking in this late stage of the pandemic? And is it prosperous? Are things going well? Are you in masses of debt like we are in the UK? How are things looking?
Well, despite Trudeau's economic incompetence, the negative policies have had a negative effect, but it hasn't wrecked the Canadian economy. The previous governments had created a huge level of fiscal and debt stability, which Trudeau was, frittering away. But he came in with a base that could sustain some silliness. By the way, interestingly enough, Canada was put on a Thatcherite course by the leader of the leftist party, and he was on the left wing of the leftist party and actually enacted reforms that would have shamed Thatcher and Reagan with his government cuts and his tax cuts and so on. So Canada was put on a good path. So we haven't had disaster, but some of the bad policies, increased taxation, increased government interference in the economy, are going to tell in the future as we fritter away the good fortune that Trudeau inherited.
Well, there you go. We're facing massive tax hikes, and we haven't even begun to talk about cuts to public spending, which I'm not sure we'll be able to talk about. There seems to be no acknowledgement that public spending could ever go anywhere other than up. That's what seems to be the case in this country. Well, do either of you have anything that you'd like to say before we finish up?
No, I'm good. I think
you're all good. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the IEA YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. We've got lots more coming every day, every week. That was Fraser Myers from Spiked Online and Fred McMahon from the Fraser Institute. Thank you.